Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. This is Social Studies. This is Mr. Lowell. It is Wednesday, May 20th, and you are about to view a presentation on Reconstruction, which is our last topic of discussion for the school year. So here linked is the Google Slides, which, if you remember, on the slides there are notes at the bottom for each of these images and pictures. And you have the response questions, which are here, which are you responding to these questions at the end of each chunk. That's the assignment you turn in. And what we'll be post on here are the videos of me, a part 1 and a part 2, explaining this topic as we go along. So without further ado, let's get started. Reconstruction is what we call the period after the Civil War. It's about 1865 to 1867. So it's about a 10 to 15 year period. It's the rebuilding of the country, and it's the readmission of the Southern Confederate States back into the Union. You really have to think about the word reconstruction, right? When you construct, you build. To reconstruct is to rebuild. So it's really a rebuilding period for the United States. It's how the United States gets back to being a united country. Our essential question today, of course, is how did America rebuild as a nation after the Civil War? There are multiple answers to this question, and it's our kind of overarching question for why we're studying this topic. Our first chunk is titled Rebuilding the Union. I want you guys to remember that it was only 5 days after the South surrendered that the war ended that Lincoln was assassinated by Confederate John Wilkes Booth. So 5 days after this happens and the leader of the nation is assassinated, he was shot in the back of the head at the Ford's Theater. And his assassination was, it's the first assassination for an American president. And it shocked the nation. It halted a lot of plans that Lincoln had for Reconstruction. Lincoln had plans to rebuild the nation, to bring the South back. And his assassination kind of halted a lot of those plans. In steps in the next president. This is Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson. He became the next in line for presidency, and he went forward with Lincoln's plans to rebuild the nation. Part of Reconstruction was oftentimes considered a military occupation of the South. That is, that the U.S. government sent federal troops into these districts, as they called it, to make sure that there was no more rebellion against the Union, that slaves were being released from their plantations as a result of the 13th Amendment, and also providing assistance for them. So there are a lot of former slaves that needed help. So as you can see here, the readmission dates, right? Like when did these states come back into the Union? And they had to make, these states had to agree to a lot of things, the emancipation of slavery. They had to agree to allow after African Americans certain civil rights and rights as citizens now of the country. Politically, what was going on in the North is the politicians that were in control of Congress were known as the radical Republicans. They were seen as radical because they wanted Southern society to change very quickly. They wanted African Americans to be given full rights, respect, and citizenship in the South. And they pushed efforts to make the South really pay for the war and accept that blacks were equal under the law. So it was really these radical politicians who wanted to completely transform the South, which was hard to do because the South was still the South. It was still incredibly racist. They were forced to give up slaves, and now the North wants to not only emancipate the slaves, but make them equal under the law. In many ways, Reconstruction was an attempt to correct the wrongs of slavery, give former slaves a chance to redefine who they were in America, force the South to accept this. The U.S. government helped form former slaves through an organization that was called the Freedmen's Bureau. And this was a government organization that helped slaves gain new skills, find lost family members, give them food and resources. They really kind of stepped in and made sure that these former slaves could thrive and do well after slavery. Southern states, in reaction to a lot of this, they passed laws that were called black codes. And these were laws that specifically designed to make sure that former slaves did not feel equal to whites and limited the freedom they had living in the South. So even though the war is over, there's no longer slavery, Southern states passed a lot of very racist laws that were designed to make sure that blacks couldn't live up to what the Constitution said they had a right to. The radical Republicans helped pass what was called the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment gave former slaves citizenship and equal treatment under the law. And it's sometimes referred to as the Civil Rights Amendment. Our civil rights are rights that we all people living in a society have under the law. And so the 14th Amendment was really important because it was an attempt to not just say, hey, you're no longer slaves, but you actually have power and freedom as a citizen in this country. Okay, a couple questions to consider. Here's your chunk questions. What efforts were made to help former slaves after the Civil War? And what plans did the U.S. government have to readmit Confederate states into the Union? The next topic is titled Reconstruction and Daily Life. The North's occupation of the South was hated and despised by Southerners. I mean, they saw the Northerners as conquerors. They came in, and they forced them to change. They won the war, and now they're forcing Southern society to change. The men and women that came from the North to help former slaves and change Southern society were especially hated. These kind of bureaucrats, these government workers, they called these people carpetbaggers because they oftentimes carried these carpeted luggage, you know, bags. And so you can see in this political cartoon 2 Union soldiers escorting this carpetbagger that's just overpowering liberty, the South's liberty. So you can tell this is a cartoon that really shows how hated they were. Here too as well, these kind of, as they called carpetbaggers, came in and kind of tried to really change the South. One of the other things that happened during this time is that because former slaves could not read or write, the government recognized that they needed to educate slaves. So they set up schools called freedmen schools. And these schools were for women and children, for adults. And sometimes you go to these schoolhouses and you would see, 30-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and small children. But the Freedmen's Bureau, this government organization, recognized that they were going to need some skills to be able to do something other than labor on plantations. Unfortunately, most former slaves, even though they were no longer slaves, stuck around in the South and worked on plantations. They had very few options of what they could do. In Congress, the radical Republicans understood that African Americans would never be successful unless they could own property and work for themselves. They needed a form of economic freedom. So some in Congress wanted to give every freed black man 40 acres and a mule. And the idea would be 40 acres to grow land, a mule to help them with that land. And that this would give these former slaves the opportunity to be successful. The idea being that they could prosper. 40 acres and a mule never happened, and many former slaves stayed on plantations working for almost nothing or very little. What a lot of former slaves did get involved in was a system that was called sharecropping. So I'll explain it here in just a minute. Basically, you can look at it in this diagram. The sharecropper is provided land. So the sharecropper is the former slave. He's given land by a landowner and seed. So he has he could grow cotton, he could grow whatever. In exchange, he promises the landowner half of his crop. So, let's say that, oh, this isn't a bad deal. You can live on my land. You can grow. I just want to take half your stuff, right? The sharecropper then has to buy food, clothing on credit from the landowner's store because he doesn't have the money to do that. So the sharecropper plants and harvests their crop, but here's the deal. The sharecropper gives the landowner what they need to sell, but they need to give end up having to give them more because they haven't paid off the debt that they owe them. And so to pay the debt, they have to promise to give a greater share each and each year, which it creates a cycle. And this cycle is really a cycle of poverty. What it really does is make sure that these people, these former slaves, don't have economic freedom and don't have economic progress. They are stuck in a cycle of poverty, of continually being in debt and not having enough money. So they're not slaves anymore. They're not owned and they're not beaten, but they're definitely being controlled in this system. And this system lasted for 80 years in the South. Um, and one of the reasons why African American communities today remain some of the poorest and the most undereducated, some people would argue, is that because of the failures of Reconstruction, because 40 acres and a mule never happened, many blacks for the next 80 years in the South would remain poor, oppressed, and inferior in society. In reaction to blacks being granted these new freedoms and their civil rights, whites began to use very violent forms of racism as a tool to intimidate and terrorize black communities. The Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK, was a hate group that tried to make blacks powerless in the South. Men wore white robes and hoods to hide their identity, and they could have been anybody. They were judges, politicians, people with real power. But part of the reason that they wore hoods was so that in society it wasn't known who they were, right? They could operate in this form of terror without being held accountable. One terror tactic the Klan used was lynching, a grotesque and violent punishment that often resulted in hanging. Lynching basically punishes a person through death, does not give them a court trial to plead their innocence, and the tactics used to keep blacks from voting, owning property, or socializing with whites in society. A couple of things I want you guys to look at here. How did sharecropping keep former slaves poor and in a cycle of poverty? And what were the goals of the Ku Klux Klan? This is going to be the end of part 1, video 1 on the Reconstruction slideshow. Part 2 you can load up in just a moment.